Here's a question that rarely gets asked, even by the most devoted fans of Western legends. What did Doc Holliday actually wear as he lay dying? Not in the movies, not in the dime novels, but in those final feverish hours when the legend's body was given out for good. We know the gunfights and the famous friends. But try, just for a moment, to picture the scene stripped down to its most physical details. No pistols, no gambling table, just the frail, sweating man and the clothes clinging to him as he faded away. With all the mythic smoke cleared, the question isn't just about fashion. It's about what the reality of dying looked like for the most famous gentleman outlaw of the Old West. So, where does Doc's enduring image as the dapper gunman even come from? Biographers and Hollywood alike have painted Doc as slick, sharp, almost aristocratic, a gambler in crisp shirts, tailored vests, and always a little cleaner, a little more refined than the rest. Whether it's in a silver screen shootout or a sepia-toned illustration, the legend sticks. Doc Holliday, the last word in outlaw style. Bow tie neatly in place, even when death comes calling. This isn't just a footnote. According to most retellings, Doc's poise and presentation held up to the very end, his final hours wrapped in dignity and a pressed surety. That well-dressed to the end image gets a lot of support in popular culture. In films, Doc is almost always shown as a kind of tragic, elegant figure, mustache trimmed, collar starched, even as he coughs into a handkerchief. Some versions have him propped up in bed, still in waistcoat and boots, facing the end with the same kind of grim, tailored composure you'd expect from a legendary gunfighter. As referenced by these portrayals, the public's memory is less about sweat, bed sores, and hospital linens, and more about a man who kept his hat and his dignity right to the finish. But let's pin down exactly what the myth is promising. It isn't just that Doc Holliday died in his boots. It's the idea that even in his final collapse, he kept his style, his self-control, and the outward grace that made him a legend. The myth offers comfort, a neat ending, a famous figure meeting death with all the trappings of the life he led. In reality, though, dignity and style are the first things disease tends to strip away. The real question is, did Doc Holliday's last hours even remotely resemble the mythic image that still lingers in our minds? The documented reality of Doc Holliday's last days is brutal. By the time he reached the Hotel Glenwood in Colorado, tuberculosis had hollowed him out. Contemporary accounts, both from people who saw him and period summaries, report that Doc was physically ravaged, barely recognizable as the gunfighter he'd once been. His body was gaunt, cheeks sunken, eyes shadowed and fever bright. He was confined almost entirely to bed, the disease stealing his strength, his appetite, and eventually even the ability to sit up without help. The man who once stalked saloons and gambling halls now spent his hours shivering and sweating, his body shrinking, every breath a small battle. These weren't just abstract symptoms. In his final decline, Doc suffered from violent coughing fits that brought up blood, a signature sign of advanced tuberculosis. Witnesses noted his frame had become skeletal, his arms and legs wasted, bones sharp beneath the skin. He could no longer move on his own. Turning over or even shifting position required assistance. The smallest exertion left him exhausted and gasping for air. He was so weak that even the basic acts of self-care, feeding himself, changing clothing, Cleaning up became impossible without help from a nurse or friend. The transformation from notorious gambler to bedridden invalid was total. And with this level of decline comes a nearly universal, if rarely mentioned, set of humiliations. Medical knowledge and period accounts make it a strong likelihood that Doc lost almost all bodily control by the end. Tuberculosis in its final stages ravages not just the lungs but the entire body. Patients sweat constantly, run high fevers, and often soil themselves in bed. Sheets become stained, clothing damp and dirty, and the patient, too weak to stand, remains helpless, reliant on others to clean them up as best they can. What was left of Doc's dignity would have vanished beneath layers of sweat, soiled linens, and the total loss of privacy. The myth of the dapper outlaw doesn't survive this reality. As the medical and physical facts close in, the legend's sense of dignity starts to crumble. It's suddenly hard to picture Doc Holliday as a figure of poise or self-command in those last hours. Instead, the mythic composure dissolves under the weight of sickness and the ordinary humiliations of dying. By this point, it's not just his reputation under threat, but the whole fantasy of a gunslinger's stylish, upright end. What remains is the body, weak, messy, and utterly at the mercy of disease. In the late 19th century, when a man was dying of tuberculosis in a hotel room, the last thing anyone worried about was dressing him up for the end. Period practice didn't involve formal clothes, suspenders, or boots for the bedridden. Instead, the standard was simple. Dying men wore long nightshirts, or whatever hospital garments were at hand. These were loose, made for comfort and practicality, easy to wash, or, more often, just easy to throw away. Everyday clothing, with its dirt and buttons and layers, was far too cumbersome to put back on a man whose body was rapidly failing him. No matter how famous or notorious, the dying were stripped down to basics. For Doc, that meant no vest, no hat, no gun belt at arm's reach, and certainly no polished boots. That Doc Holliday's last hours were spent in a long, sweat-soaked nightshirt, not dress clothes. The shirt would have been thin from repeated washing, stained with sweat and possibly blood, clinging to his skin as his fever spiked and broke. Given his weakness, it's also probable he had no socks or boots on, just bare feet sticking out from tangled sheets. With every hour, the small indignities of illness built up. The nightshirt would have grown wet, grimy, even crusted from constant coughing, fever, and the daily realities of being too ill to care for himself. This wasn't just the loss of style. It was the loss of any barrier between Doc Holliday and the slow, humiliating work of dying. The physical humiliation would have been total. The smell in that room, a mix of stale sweat, unwashed skin, sickness, and whatever passed for disinfectant would have been impossible to ignore. Soiling was a near certainty. The sheets and nightshirt marked by the body's failures may be changed by nurses when possible, but never truly clean. His hands, once steady at a poker table or quick to draw, now trembled and gripped nothing. There was no mythic dignity left, only the raw, sensory reality of decline, inescapable and witnessed by anyone who entered the room. And this is where the legend fully unravels. The carefully constructed myth of Doc Holliday, the sharp-dressed, unflappable gunman, stylish to his last breath, can't withstand the truth of his final hours. Faced with the odor, the stains, the helplessness, and the bare feet, any notion of a dapper death dissolves completely. What remains isn't a cinematic outlaw, but a human being overwhelmed by disease, stripped down to the plainest, most vulnerable state imaginable. But that final, humiliating reality never made it into the myth. On screen and in the pages of countless biographies, Doc Holliday was kept perfectly preserved, hats tilted just so, boots polished, cuffs crisp, all the way to his dying breath. Attribute this to Hollywood's stylized westerns and the popular histories that followed. They erased the stench, the sweat, the trembling hands, and replaced them with a clean, heroic silhouette. The legend became its own kind of armor, protecting viewers from the discomfort of a real, physical death. In these retellings, you won't find any mention of soiled nightshirts, bare feet, or the indignities of disease. Instead, every lingering shot and literary flourish keeps Doc's exit as dapper and composed as the best tailor in Tombstone could manage. That version of the story endures because it's easier to admire and far easier to market than the true bodily end. If you come looking for the actual Doc Holliday in his last hours, what you find is not dignity, but naked frailty. The real scene, pieced together from the physical facts of tuberculosis, the practices of late 19th century hospital wards, and the absence of any barrier between illness and body, leaves no room for mythic clothing. By the end, the man who once faced down gunfighters and outplayed gamblers was reduced to a body failing in every way. Nightshirts wet with sweat and worse, sheets that could never really be clean, limbs too weak to even support the illusion of style. There's no sense of cinematic poise, just the plain humiliation of being seen, by nurses, by undertakers, maybe by old friends. In a state stripped of everything but suffering, the legend of the dapper gunman does not survive contact with the reality of Doc's final moments. The loop is resolved. There is no heroic wardrobe at the end, only the truth of a man undone by disease. Here's the grounded truth. There is no surviving record of exactly what Doc Holliday wore as he died. No inventory, no deathbed photograph, not even an undertaker's note. What we have is a plausible, damning reconstruction. The likely nightshirt, the soiled bedding, the missing boots, and the bare feet. All the rest is empty myth, filled in by storytellers who couldn't or wouldn't stare directly at the physical realities of decline. So, any specific detail about Doc's last outfit is, at best, educated guesswork, anchored in the discomforts of terminal illness in the 1880s. The legend is a costume. The real man ended in borrowed linens and stains. In the end, it's not the legend's cool that lingers. It's the vulnerability. The dignity of the myth dissolves under the weight of actual, physical humiliation. We remember Doc Holliday not as the untouchable, sharp-dressed outlaw, but as a human being, defeated not by bullets or rivals, but by the slow, unavoidable undoing of his own body. And that, maybe, is the one story Hollywood will never film.